In the beginning, there was Henry Angelo the Younger. Hello, I'm part of the Blue Jackets Reenactment Society. We portray sailors from the Royal Navy from the reign of Queen Victoria up until the Navy's intervention in the Russian Civil War of 1919. One of our most popular displays is to show people how the Navy used the Cutlass. During these videos, I'm going to show you the systems that the Navy used to train its crews to fight with a Cutlass. The first system that we're going through is the first system that the Admiralty officially adopted all the way back in 1813. This is before the Navy had created a uniform for its men. There was still a distinct nautical style, but nothing was regulated. So, the men that Henry Angelo was teaching would not have been wearing a square rig like this. They would probably have looked more like this sketch by James Gilray from about 1795. The system that he taught them was based on the system taught at his London school. This school had been created by his grandfather, Domenico Angelo, in 1738. Domenico's son continued his work, as well as producing a manual on how to use the Highland broadsword. Henry Angelo the Younger took over from him. His legacy would be a system of manuals for the sword and the bayonet. The British Army could use these systems for almost the entire 19th century, and they had become the benchmark upon which all later systems would have to try and improve upon. He got this position almost by accident. In 1812, he'd been on board HMS Norwich with his friend Captain Rainier. The frigate was taking part in the blockade of the Dutch ports. Maintaining the blockade was important, but it was also really boring. Since he had one of the most famous swordsmen in Britain on board, Captain Rainier asked Mr. Angelo if he'd be willing to do something to entertain the crew. What Mr. Angelo decided to do was to give the men a lesson in how they would use their cutlasses. He took his father's broadsword system and cut it down. A lot. The result was just enough to get an untrained sailor effective with his cutlass in the small time that he had available. Had an officer paid for tuition in his London school, and let's face it, no ordinary sailors would have been able to afford it, he would have learned many more techniques, and like an early form of pay to win. The Admiralty decided to use this as the standard method for training their sailors. Then a few years later, the British Army came along looking for a sword training system. So Mr. Angelo sold them a similar system. And by similar, I mean it looks like he just had his clerk rub out the pictures of sailors and replace them with stick figures in the same positions. The Cutlass exercise became a normal part of physical training for sailors in the fleet. By the Victorian era, they were doing it 3 times a week, and they were sparring with single sticks. It became a popular sport. This is a single stick. It's a stick with a leather or wicker handguard. This would have been used with helmets and padded jackets to make you get used to hitting each other full force without the risk of lopping each other's limbs off. Unfortunately, all that remains of the Cutlass exercise are the illustrations that I've just mentioned. There are no complete manuscripts, but there are plenty of copies of the identical infantry sword exercise, as the Army was so happy with their edition of the system that they continued using it almost unchanged to nearly the end of the Victorian era. This is the system that Sir Richard Francis Burton would criticise in the 1870s, and John Musgrave Waite would try to replace in 1880. However, Waite had not been an officer during his time in the Army, so they kept Angelo's system until they could get another gentleman, the Italian fencing master Fernando Mesiello, produce a new infantry sword exercise for them in 1895. By the time that Mesiello had finished his new infantry sword exercise, the Navy had already gone through at least 4 versions of the Cutlass exercise. After creating his system, Henry Angelo would become the Navy's fencing master and held the title of superintendent of the sword exercise until his death in 1852. Shortly after this, the Navy decided it would need to simplify its already simple system. They wanted something that would take even less time to teach, as their sailors were having to deal with increasingly large and complicated ships. They cut down the number of guards and cuts until there were just 3 guards and 2 cuts. This was found to be too limited, so they added 2 of them back again, and while the Army continued all 7 guards and cuts of the Angelo system. I'm using an edition of the Army Manual from 1817, which was scanned by the Academy of Historical Fencing and is available from their website. I've added a link to it in the description of this video. At the time that this manual was printed, sailors would have been using the 1804 pattern cutlass, which I am not carrying. This is because before he allowed his sailors to get their hands on a cutlass, Mr. Angelo taught them the footwork that they would need so as not to slip over on the moving deck of a ship. And this is the drill that we shall start going through in the next video.